Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Recently I saw a video from armed attorneys and it's titled, Don't Carry a Trauma Kit. Now what that video is about is whether or not you should carry a trauma kit, so tourniquets, chest seal, all of that good stuff for dealing with serious injuries, particularly if you are also carrying a firearm or other weapon for self-defense purposes. Now, I'm going to have some responses to that video, and we've kind of already had some spoilers as to where it's going, but here's their basic thesis.
Range bag, vehicle, if you're a first responder, maybe on your person, otherwise probably a bad idea.
I'm just going to go on and say a bad idea.
But I want to hear what y'all have to say.
Now, it's good that they want to hear from us because I've got some opinions. And we're going to keep this respectful because they're practicing lawyers in their field, reasonable minds can differ and all of that. But I think this is a really bad take, and I'm going to explain why I'm not persuaded by their arguments. We're going to review those in brief. I'm not going to go through their whole video, just sort of the key points. But you should watch my video and you should watch their video and decide for yourselves what you think makes most sense. Let me know in the comments section below. I mean, maybe I'm out to lunch. I will ask that if you go over to their video, please be respectful in their comment section. Don't make me into a bad guest here. I really don't want to see that. So please, if you go and comment there, just be respectful. That's what I'm asking here. Now, I will also address one major elephant in the room, which is that I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. But I think a lot of these principles apply generally. Canada and the US have a lot of similarities in their self-defense rules, at least once you get into a self-defense situation. We have a lot of similarities in our court systems. So I don't think that's a major failure here, but again, you should be aware of that as well. All right. Now, I will also note that there are some reasons why you might not want to carry a trauma kit. Some ones that make a lot of sense here are that a trauma kit is a bit of a bulky item. You can't necessarily fit it in everything. You might not have enough pockets and so forth. That's going to be a consideration. Anything that you have displaces something else you could have. Another thing, of course, is that they do have some cost. However, those costs have been coming down quite a bit. You might not want to buy the cheapest trauma kit out there because this is life-saving equipment. Might not be the best place to cut corners, but you can still get a pretty reasonable one for fairly inexpensive these days. And, if you're carrying a firearm and training with the firearm, the cost of the trauma kit actually end up being pretty minimal. So I don't think this is the most serious consideration, but it is on the list. The next is, of course, training itself. Anything you're using as defensive or life-saving equipment is something you should be trained on. And at a minimum, I mean, going through the thing and learning what everything is for and where it is in the kit is important, but really this is something that should be paired with something like a Stop the Bleed course or a first aid course or something like that. And quite frankly, I think that those are things that are worth taking regardless of whether or not you're going to carry a trauma kit. They're just a good idea. The last thing, of course, is considerations of you won't be able to take this thing everywhere, and there may be actual consequences if you try to take it to the wrong places. So airplanes, prisons, courthouses, all of these kinds of places may have restrictions. They might not like, for instance, the trauma shears that are often in these things. So that's something you need to consider as to where you're going to be going with these things and whether or not these are going to be restricted items. But those aren't really the considerations that they're looking at. Instead, they're addressing what happens if you get into a self-defense shooting or other use of force scenario, and then you're going and applying this trauma kit to particularly to the person who was injured. So let's look at their arguments and I'll sort of address them in turn. And then I'll address, I think, the larger argument that they kind of breeze past and that I think is a really significant issue in this whole consideration. So I guess on to their first argument.
First of all, if you are in a self-defense situation, you have a trauma kit, say you have a trauma kit and you use it. Should we start there?
Yeah, let's see what happens.
So you have a trauma kit and you use it. If I'm a prosecutor, and Richard and I, of course, are former prosecutors, so we know how to think dirty. Not like, you know what I mean, but like we know like how to twist things against the self-defender. And I think that if I'm that prosecutor, I'm going to say, you shot someone and then you immediately ran over to save their life. You know what that says to me? Consciousness of guilt,
Ooh, that's a good one.
right?
Now, when he says, ooh, that's a good one, I think what he means is that's good as in it's clever to think this up, but I don't feel that it's a good argument in terms of it being a strong argument. In fact, if this is the best argument the prosecution has to defeat a self-defense claim, I think you're getting acquitted. When we think about the reasons why you might use force in self-defense, they're really to preserve your life or your safety, or the life or safety of some third party. Now, what you can show by applying aid is that in fact that goal continues. Not only are you out to preserve life in the face of this attack by using force, but afterwards you still are trying to preserve life even to the person who just attacked you. This can help really undermine a lot of the common arguments that get made in terms of you acting out of vengeance or out of a desire to kill somebody or, malice or any of this, because in fact now you are engaged in this act of trying to save their lives. Certainly, the prosecution can try to twist this, as she says, and some people might criticize her for that, framing. I don't. I think she's perfectly right. The prosecution will try to, twist things in order to undercut or undermine your self-defense argument. They may try to confront you with all of these notions in front of a jury in order to suggest some alternate version of things. But I think they're going to have a much harder time doing that with you applying aid than with any of the other options. Certainly in the Rittenhouse trial, we saw that him not applying aid was something that the prosecution tried to use against him, even though he was in a situation where he had to flee because there was a sort of gathering crowd there. Anything you do can be potentially twisted, but I feel like trying to save the life of the attacker is one of those things that is going to be harder to twist than other things. Certainly, leaving the scene is a lot easier to spin into a consciousness of guilt sort of argument. And, if you just sit there and watch them die, well, now you sound like the villain from a Johnny Cash song, shot a man in Reno just to watch him die. It's not a terribly persuasive or sympathetic look. Personally, I would much rather, if there was a self-defensive situation, see that my client had tried to render some sort of assistance. So I disagree with them pretty profoundly on this one. All right, on to the next argument.
Yeah, I think what would be more low-hanging fruit for a prosecutor is just say, this guy's a lunatic.
Right, yeah. He was just, that's their go-to, right? Anytime if you have more than one firearm on you, if you have anything unusual, it's going to be, this guy is a crazy nut job who was looking to get into a shooting situation. Right. He was just dying to have to, use this stuff. And so he created the situation. We've talked about that before.
Now, this is absolutely something that happens. If you're in a self-defense situation, anything that you're carrying, whether it's a defensive item or otherwise, is something that they might try to use to spin to suggest that you instigated or provoked a fight or continued it after you could have stopped or are otherwise at fault in this situation. Now, that might be a reason not to carry certain kinds of items, but I don't think it's a really strong one with respect to first aid items, because it seems a little unusual to say, listen, I wanted to get into a fight and shoot a guy just to save his life afterwards. That seems like a bit of a stretch. Usually the argument they make is that you were carrying some particularly dangerous kind of item because you wanted a fight or you liked violence and so forth. Quite famously, they'll tend to do this with ammunition. If you're carrying full metal jacket ammunition, they'll say, oh, isn't that what the military uses? And so it's super scary and dangerous. Whereas if you're carrying hollow point ammunition, they'll say, oh, isn't that for maximum lethality? And it's so dangerous that it's banned for use by the military. You can't win. However you decide to go, they're going to spin it. There is no firearm choice that, will prevent this. There's no winning this game. But I feel like this argument is a little harder to make with first aid items and can be additionally dissuaded or deflected by just being more prepared. I have a video talking about how it's good to carry an naloxone kit because you might be able to save someone's life with it. And if you're concerned about this kind of argument, well, an naloxone kit on your person also is something that can be used to sort of deflect this, because Nobody's carrying around naloxone in the hopes that they're going to, save someone's life to the extent that they're going to like inject some random person with fentanyl just to naloxone them. Like, doesn't that sound ridiculous when you put it into that context? And so this gives your defense counsel some ammunition to possibly rebut that. There's all sorts of other similar items that might be useful in that sense. I carry around a seatbelt cutter. I'm not hoping to get into a car accident that I've got to cut my way out of, but if I do, I'd like to have it. An EpiPen, all of these sorts of things can potentially deflect this. But I think, quite frankly, if the prosecution is suggesting that you have this trauma kit in the hopes that you're going to shoot somebody and then save them, it's going to sound like they're reaching. I don't think that this is really something that is going to sell well to a jury. I'm just not seeing it. So, all right, let's have a look at the next argument.
That's where prosecutors are very sneaky, because they're going to say, you had a trauma kit on you. You could have helped them, and you didn't because you wanted them to die, right? I mean, but remember, if you are involved in a self-defense shooting, you can do nothing right in the eyes of the prosecutor.
They are right about this. If you have a trauma kit or a medical kit and you fail to render aid to somebody you've just used force against, a prosecutor could use that to make you look really bad in front of a jury. Of course, the same thing applies to if you've taken a CPR course or a stop the bleed course or any other sort of training, and I don't think that they'd suggest that you should not take those things just in this possibility. And the same thing applies even if you don't have any of this stuff, even if you don't have medical supplies and you don't have any training, they'd still say, why did you just stand there and watch the person die? The way to get around this is by applying medical attention as best you can to the person who you've just used force against, or having a good reason that you can articulate as to why you didn't. For instance, in the Rittenhouse trial, being able to say, listen, there was an angry mob gathering, I had to get out of there. The prosecutors still tried to use that against Rittenhouse, but it didn't work out so well for them. If there's active dangers, if the person themselves is still a threat, if the building is on fire and you have to leave, whatever it is, something that you can articulate to say why you didn't attempt to apply aid. I can say that I've had self-defense cases where medical attention has been provided, or at least an attempt at medical attention by the person who needed to use force in self-defense. And in my experience, that's always played well with a prosecutor. I've had clients who stayed out of jail because I could point to it and say, listen, this guy's not a bad guy. He wasn't trying to hurt this guy. He's even trying to patch him up afterwards. So I disagree with this pretty strongly. I guess let's see what's next.
There's a humongous difference legally between someone who has died and someone who has just suffered serious bodily injury.
There is. And that's where, you kind of, again, I don't know that I want you rendering aid, but I always hope that the person doesn't die.
Right.
And you will hear lawyers say different things. There are lawyers who say, well, one story is one story and that's way better than two stories. And so shoot them where it counts.
So this segment really raises two different legal considerations, and we'll address both. And you might think, wait a second, aren't they kind of arguing against their main thesis here? Well, they're presenting both sides. They're sort of trying to show us the counter arguments or the issues with their own position. And that's a good thing. This is something that we should commend, so I like to see this. Now, the first issue that they're raising here is that there's a massive difference in legal jeopardy between if there's a situation where somebody's been killed versus if they're merely injured. And I say merely injured, but those injuries could be serious. You could be talking about somebody with brain damage that will prevent them from doing really anything for the rest of their life. But the fact that they're still having a rest of their life creates a huge difference. And that might mean literally decades of potential jail time shaved off by that survival. And normally in a court case, if you can take decades off of somebody's potential sentence, we'd consider that a tremendous win. That's a huge benefit. The other thing, and they mention these things, go watch their video. It's a decent video. Check it out. But if somebody is dead, it opens up a lot of funding doors and resourcing doors that may not be opened if you're actually dealing with somebody who's survived. And that can be a major impact. The state can always out-resource you in these cases if they choose to, and they're much more likely to choose to if you've got a situation where there's an actual fatality. That starts opening doors for, crime scene investigators, for blood spatter, for use of force experts, for all of this stuff, all of which costs money. And they're a lot more likely to be willing to spend that money if there's, an actual fatality. If you look at some of the big trials, in Canada, we've had the trial of Peter Cahill. And, this process wouldn't be possible in the States, but he was acquitted. It was taken all the way up to the Supreme Court. Series of trials that leads to an eventual conviction. I don't think they'd have put in all of that work if it was a charge of aggravated assault versus a charge of murder. So, huge distinction, and I think that you're almost always better off facing the charge of, whatever the injury charge is versus a murder charge or any sort of homicide related charge. So that's kind of the first consideration. You're much happier if that person survives, and that provides an additional reason to provide aid. If you keep that person from bleeding out on your floor, even though they've broken into your house, you're probably happier with that eventual result. The other point, and this is one you'll see often raised, not as much by lawyers, but you'll see it raised in a lot of self-defense forums and so forth, is, listen, if this person survives, then they're going to present the, they're going to point the finger at you. They're going to be there to testify against you. And first, that shouldn't be part of your consideration. That's not something that should be a factor in your self-defense thing, especially because if that's how you're thinking, it might lead you to take steps that could get you into a lot of trouble. For instance, firing a second shot when someone's on the ground, if they're not a danger to you at that point, could mean that you've just taken yourself from a justified self-defense situation where you're going to be acquitted into a straight-up murder situation where you're going to die in a cell. That's not a great place to be, and so that kind of thinking can be dangerous. You don't want to be thinking, hey, it's better if this person dies, because usually, at least in a jeopardy sense, it isn't. The other thing is that I feel that this one is really misstated, because often it isn't actually that detrimental to have the person testifying against you, because they're actually going to be there to testify against you, and not just the memory of them. What I mean by that is that when you're dealing with a murder trial, everyone, like the victim on that, always comes off as this sainted figure because, of course, they're dead, and you're only going to hear sort of the best things about them. Whereas if you actually bring these people into court, often the people who end up being on the sort of receiving end of a self-defense use of force are not great witnesses and not great people. If you think of the Rittenhouse shooting, if Rosenbaum had been brought in to testify, I bet he'd have been destroyed on the stand. I bet he would have been a terrible witness, and in fact would have made it a lot less likely, not more likely, for Rittenhouse to be convicted at the end of the day. You bring in these witnesses and there's somebody with facial tattoos and clear gang affiliation. Well, that's not a problem. That actually is likely to convince the jury that, yeah, this guy was actually a danger. So I think that this one can really cut both ways, but more often than not, having the guy actually there to try to stammer through a lie about how he got lost and just somehow ended up in your living room with a crowbar and a handgun tucked in his vest, usually that tends to play better for the defense than you might think. So those are my thoughts on that one. Let's keep going. So that pretty much exhausts their arguments about why it's a bad idea to carry a trauma kit. And hopefully at this point you're watching this video and thinking, maybe I'd actually rather get a trauma kit and some training and all of this. But if you're not there yet, I do have a little bit more to say. And the first thing I'm going to note is that I'm not going to address the moral question. They say in their video, listen, you shouldn't take moral advice from us. We're lawyers. Fair enough. It would kind of feel like coming at them sideways when they're really not making a moral case for this either way, sort of opening up a new avenue of attack. But the other thing is that morality on this one gets pretty subjective. People have very differing takes on it. And so I'm going to leave the moral question for you guys. That's something you will personally have to address with whatever your personal convictions are. I'm going to stick to the pragmatic issues. And there's a giant one that they actually kind of mention and then just blow past like it's no big deal, when I think it's fatal to everything else they have to say. So let's have a look at that.
If you are ever in a situation, I mean, let's say that you're in a situation where there is a shooting around you, right?
Yep.
And maybe a stranger gets shot, maybe your wife or your child or, someone to that effect gets shot.
Yep.
You have that, compression seal, you have the tourniquet, you have the,
Packing.
the packing material, exactly, the gauze. You could potentially preserve someone's life until EMS gets there. It's very, very powerful.
That clip actually comes from towards the beginning of their video, and the purpose is really to explain why they're talking about trauma kits at all. But they're quite correct when they say that this is something that might allow you to save the life of a stranger, of your spouse, of your child, or even, and they don't mention this, but yourself. Because there's no guarantee that you walk away from a self-defense situation uninjured. Lots of self-defense situations start with somebody getting stabbed and then fighting to preserve their own life. And if there is some sort of shooting or the like, there's no guarantee that you walk away, untouched. It's an old truism that the winner of a knife fight is often the person who doesn't die on the scene, but instead dies in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Well, a trauma kit might mean that you make it that additional time and make it to the hospital and make it out of the hospital, which sounds to me like a win. Now, all of this seems very strange when we put it into the context of them saying, well, we don't recommend carrying a trauma kit, because they do recommend carrying a handgun in the first place to protect your life and the lives of your spouse and your child and innocent strangers. And it seems really weird to me that you'd say, listen, for all of those reasons, I'm willing to carry the weapon, but I'm not willing to carry a trauma kit. That's a little bit too much legal risk. That's where I draw the line. To me, that seems just absolutely bizarre, because the legal risk from carrying a trauma kit, I think, is fairly minimal, and is absolutely minimal when you compare it to the actual weapon itself. So, yeah. And just to really emphasize this point, I've got a bit of an audio clip, so I'm not going to play the video, but let's listen.
Aaron! Aaron! No! 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 Face! Aaron! Baby! Baby!
So that's the sound of a woman realizing that her husband is dying in front of her. And I did find similar clips of people realizing that their child was dying, and quite frankly, those were too heart-wrenching to play. But I will tell you, if you listen to that audio clip, I'm pretty sure that she would have given anything to have a trauma kit on hand. And that applies to anybody who might be defending the lives of their children or their spouse. Do you really want to be sitting there in a situation where you may have successfully fended off the attack only to watch your child die in front of you and thinking, I could have had a trauma kit on me, but I decided not to because I listened to these two people from the internet? I don't think that's something you want to be, facing. That's not something I want for you guys. I think you'd rather have the trauma kit. And they certainly say, you know what, it's okay to have one in your car or, your range bag. Sometimes your car is just too dang far away. So personally, I'd say carry the trauma kit and get the training for it. If you can possibly fit it in your, day-to-day carry, it is a thing to have. And yeah, that's kind of my take. Let me know in the comments below. Maybe you think I'm out to lunch on this one, but I kind of think that my take is better. And yeah. So thank you for watching. Please like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to see more content. And yeah, I want to thank my Patreon supporters at the $50 level. Canada's National Farms Association, the CCFR, the Canadian Shooting Sports Association, and David Michaud. At the $30 level, Sights and Arms Limited and Jane Babe and Luxor. And at the $20 level, Mark, Lindsay Metcalf, Kyle Fox, Haywire, Gerald to the Bailey, Dale Nesbitt, Cameron Johnson, Andrew Elsage, and Vicky. So, yeah, I mean, I've talked to lots of people who say that they carry, you know, a firearm, because I talk to lots of Americans who are from a place where they can do so. And they say, you know, listen, I couldn't live with myself if my kid was injured and, you know, I had the opportunity to be able to protect them and I just didn't have the equipment. I feel like that applies to the trauma kit. I cannot get behind this particular interpretation. And yeah, thanks for watching. See you next time. And I hope I've armed you with knowledge.